Is Yevgeny Prigozhin dead? What's your best knowledge of what's happened?
I think we can reasonably assume that he is dead. The Russian authorities have said he is. The latest brief from the Pentagon says that he is. I don't think any of the conspiracy theories out there hold water. I think we can say with fair certainty that Prigozhin is dead.
If anyone else was inclined to now rise up against Vladimir Putin, does this development put any thought of dissent to bed?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is done in a way that sends a very clear and very public message to anyone who either might have been aligned with Prigozhin or who had similar thoughts about rising up against Putin or elements of his regime. So, I think that anyone who is thinking about it is certainly looking in the mirror today thinking, not today.
What happens now to Wagner now that its senior leadership has been wiped out?
Well, someone in the Kremlin, probably Putin himself, will take control over it. Many senior Russians have their own private armies. The Wagner Group will be subsumed into one of those, whether it's by the Russian military or Putin himself. It's a good revenue raiser for somebody in Russia. They won't want to see that go away. So Wagner won't go away, but it'll look different and it'll have a different boss.
What role do these independent armies perform, and to what extent will they more broadly retain their independence and present that sort of risk that Yevgeny Prigozhin himself has presented to Vladimir Putin?
Well, many senior Russian officials and wealthy Russian oligarchs have their own private armies for security. But for people like Putin, these provide another layer of security in addition to normal government security aspects. For Ukraine itself, Defence Minister Shoigu issued a directive back in June that all private military companies, of which there are quite a few, would come under the control of the Russian military in Ukraine. And I think that this really kills any dissent over that directive issued by Shoigu.
How dependent is the Russian military on these mercenaries, particularly in the war in Ukraine?
Well, they're dependent on them for manpower, but the Russian military still provides a huge amount of logistics support. I mean, the Wagner Group received a massive amount of equipment and munitions from the Russian military. We saw Prigozhin in January and May complaining about the lack of ammunition from the Russian military. So, there's a relationship that's two ways here. The private military companies provide people, the Russian military provides direction and equipment.
Presumably those criticisms that Yevgeny Prigozhin had raised, those issues still stand, don't they? Those issues around munitions, around strategy?
Well, absolutely. I think the most dangerous thing that Prigozhin said just before his march on Moscow was call into question the rationale behind this war. I mean, Putin over several years has given multiple speeches around why Ukraine is a threat to Russian security. Well, Prigozhin blew all that away with saying, no, this is just about wealthy Russians wanting to enrich themselves. That was a huge danger to Putin, and he had to kill not just Prigozhin, but the stories that Prigozhin were telling.
What impact does this have on the war in Ukraine? Because Yevgeny Prigozhin's death ties directly back to a war that's affected all of us indirectly.
Well, I think it'll have a minimal impact overall. I mean, there are some Russian officers who've been sidelined or purged as a result of this, the most visible of whom is General Surovikin, who was the commander last year. But ultimately, these senior officers are replaceable. The Russians have lots and lots of generals and senior officers. Whether they're as good as Surovikin or not is irrelevant. It's their loyalty that now counts. So I expect this won't have a major impact on the fighting in Ukraine in the short and medium term.